today we're going to hear from one of our own members, Riley Moore, who hopefully all of you know by now. We had scheduled a different program, but last minute they said they couldn't do it. And Riley said, oh, I've got one. It sounded good to me because it has to do with local. He is, of course, a professor here at St. Martin's, and they did a survey with your whole class. Who did the survey?
Well, it's a group of students, right?
Oh yeah, a group of students did a survey for the city of Olympia about the quality of life in this area. And since, even though it's City of Olympia, we're all kind of tied together anyhow, the three communities. And so it should be interesting to find out what some of the results of this survey are. So let's have Riley come up and tell us what they found out.
Actually, well, thank you, Larry, for the opportunity to share. This was actually a this presentation is sort of sharing a initiative that was started probably in December of last year, so it's coming up on a year, where the downtown Olympia folks, primarily Bob Lobana, some of you are aware of, a fellow Rotarian with the Olympia Club, was interested in what can we do to revitalize and spark livability for downtown Olympia. As you know, I mean, there's been a lot of changes and issues with homelessness and other things, and certainly with him owning the marina down there, and I think other members that have a large stake in that part were sort of questioning, you know, what could be done. One of the things that came out of it, we said, well, why don't we do a literature review of, you know, in terms of best practices, and use that as a basis for going forward. So what I'm sharing is, as Larry pointed out, concurrently, we had also done a survey for the Thurston Climate Action Team that was assessing, and some of you heard that, you know, they've been making the rounds with the various councils and municipalities, but about climate change and perceptions of climate change for Thurston County residents, and that was concluded in July. But one of the first questions we asked is, what do you think about the quality of life for Thurston County? So just wanted to share, it's actually a very positive result. Based on that survey that ties into this particular discussion. So, as you said, the issue of what are catalysts for change and would drive economic development. Again, the issue is, as Larry pointed out as well, the application applies to Lacey and Tumwater as well. It just happened to be a case study focusing on Olympia. And the first discussion occurred December 4th. I think some of you in the room were involved with that. You know, I don't know if David Shafford's here, but he's been involved as well. But and the question became, what can we do to, what's the catalyst for vitality and livability? And then we had a series of meetings over the summer, and then the last one was the beginning of September. And what came out of the meeting, and as you probably, some of you can probably relate to this, there seemed to be also the broader question of, you know, what's downtown, right? And I don't, this was, the group talked about certainly Olympia. There seems to be a downtown Olympia, then there's also a West Olympia, and certainly even Ralph's Surfway. Some folks are saying that seems to be, you know, sort of somewhat of a pocket. Then Lacey, you know, I guess we're still going through actually a typo there. Woodland Square, and then Hawks Prairie, you know, sort of the issue. And then also with the Tumwater Brewery District and the Tumwater City Hall component. So I think a lot of that's sort of still playing out. But for the purposes of this process, we just looked at downtown Olympia. So in the process of going through, and I have the full report, I gave a copy to Ken, and anybody who wants it, it was sort of went through quite a few different studies. The main one actually, the idea of trying to assess the downtown, the EDC's been doing this for, you know, in terms of just getting a pulse on the economy, the Economic Vitality Index. There's also a Creativity Vitality Index that EDC's pushing out now. Also the United Way, starting back as far back as 1999. 2003, 2009, some of you probably were involved in that process, is more in terms of just giving ideas of giving patterns and volunteerism, but also within those surveys were questions of what do you think about, you know, the local community and the vitality. And throughout those surveys, it's always been very positive in terms of this area. As much as negative news sells, and you sometimes, you know, get focused on your own issues relative to other areas, the message seemed to come through with these other studies that overall, we're a pretty good location. And then it was interesting looking at Richard Florida is probably, some of you are probably familiar also with economic development. He started a big discussion back in 2002. He said, what drives economic development? He said, is it people or place, or is it industries and firms? And his premise was that it's people and place that's driving the new economy and certainly creativity. And he said, what is a catalyst or sort of the key component to this new paradigm is that you have to have creative individuals that, and when we say creative, that certainly he called a super creative class, of which might be the musicians, the artists, and things along those lines. But he said basically it's creative, meaning in the context that they're problem solvers, that they think outside the box. And he identified at that point, and it seems to have been held out over time, and it cuts across all professions, people that are problem solvers. He identified some key areas where he seemed to see the most of that occurring. And he said that's probably about a third of the workforce, but yet they generate about half the income. And so that was his work, and again, 13 years ago, that's been an ongoing debate. Then there's been some additional components. Also, the literature showed that we seem to be moving maybe suburbia, to the idea that the sprawl is changing. When they were looking at venture capitalists in the IT sectors and stuff, there seems to be these creative individuals who are coming back to urban areas and particularly, tend to thrive in that. Also, it comes through in the literature that, and again, a lot of this is just looking at what's currently going on, but that individuals tend to, peers want to hang out with other peers that are similar. And that's a question, it's fascinating from an academic point of view because, I asked my students, I said, well, how many think you're going to find or would like to stay in Thurston County or more inclined to go to King County? And most of them, as you probably anticipate, think, well, geez, King County is probably where I'm going to find a job if I'm not going to be looking for something, with the state. And that only adds, obviously, as you know, to the traffic congestion and other things. And there's no reason, that they have to think about going to King County. But obviously, there is about a 20% cost of living difference between here and King County, just going 60 miles up the I-5 corridor. But it's also close to about a $20,000 difference for a similar kind of job classification. So again, but there's opportunity costs. It's not just salary, but the time you're sitting in the car for the commute and everything else. So just a lot of work has been done on this, and so we've then decided to duplicate this at the city level to see how our creative class compared to other areas. But first of all, though, one of the things I was going to mention in the study, they said part of that paradigm shift is also we sometimes measure economic vitality or is the education level, and Florida and others have questioned that, saying, if we just looked at education, we would have missed, the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs. It's ironically, they argue that it's probably more occupation, and not necessarily if somebody, has a 4-year degree or a master's or a doctorate. So they said the better accurate assessment, we just look at just the occupational classifications. But still, a while back, I ran wanted to see how Thurston County ranked relative to the other counties with unemployment versus education, even though the creative class argument says it's job classifications. As you can see, though, there's a higher correlation there that if you have a higher educated workforce, that you're probably going to have less unemployment. So that was a pretty strong relation. You see Thurston County, we were 33, we were way down there with unemployment. This was as of 2011 when I was looking at this, when we were still struggling. And the education level, we were ranked right up there, just right behind King County. And obviously, as you know, most of that state government. We pull the best into this area for that. Also, just to give an idea of, King County is the big gorilla in the state. It's not fair, right? If you took King County out of the rankings, we would drop way down. And just sort of to look at that, again, this is a study that I did. I took all the top companies, I just selected the top 20, private and public, and I tried to relate them by revenue. This is not returns, but revenues by the GDP of countries, and then total those up within about a 20-mile concentric circle of downtown Seattle. And that area is the size of Saudi Arabia in terms of GDP. So that gives you an idea of just the economic clout that we have just to the north of us. And certainly when you look at the clusters, I think there's almost seven Nobel laureates in medicine alone. So the biotech cluster, and we got the IT sector cluster, and then we have, the aerospace cluster, right? As you know, aerospace is synonymous for Boeing, right? When you look at trade statistics. So all that is certainly driving a lot of activity up in that area. And you've heard the news that Seattle is the fastest growing city. It's dropped in ranking as of May. Ironically, now it's Austin, and that Austin plays a key role in this presentation. But you can see on the side it doesn't show up that well. But really, I mean, part of it is a lot of you've come from Seattle and know that area. I mean, there's not too much room to expand. I certainly can go vertical, but you're surrounded by water, and then you've got the Cascades, and you've got congestion, and so we are starting to see, folks just, regardless of what's happening, they're starting to look elsewhere. And so we're also positioned. The question is are we on the cusp of seeing some major changes? And a lot of these exogenous variables, like what's going on to the north, are certainly drivers as well. So the question is, do we have a creative component of what I guess Dr. Florida talks about? And then also we have some other variables that sort of make a very compelling picture that we're sort of on the cusp of some major changes here in the near future. But we are still a major growth area, certainly if we get up to the north a little bit. So what we did is I took, just duplicated Florida's work on looking at how you classify creative classes. I'll show you that just using U.S. Census, the American Community Survey data, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Fortunately, what he does is his classifications fall along the standard occupational classification code, and you can break that down to the city level. So it was a matter of just pulling that together and running the ratios. And then for place, so the key people in place are the key terms here. Is that Florida's idea is that it's the people in place that drive economic development. So if you have the right people and you have the right place, then you're primed for being, one of the peak areas. And so the question is, for a proxy for how do you measure place, I just used the survey that we just did in July and looking at some of the past surveys, and it seems to play out that regardless of people's affiliation or, as far as where they are, overall we are, I think, somewhat in consensus that this is a nice area to live and raise a family and raise, go the education systems, K-12, higher ed, and everything else. So this is how, when I ran those numbers for the creative class, if you look at on your left there, Boulder, Colorado, Seattle, San Francisco, I just abbreviated San Fran there, Austin and Portland are already recognized as areas that are hip and thriving in terms of the next generation. And then obviously you have a lot of activity going on there. And then for the sake of it, I don't know if some of you heard of it, it's been in the news lately that Yakima is the place to go to. Has anybody heard that? It's a hip place, and so I threw that in the mix just to say, who would want to go to Yakima? But obviously, I apologize. I mean, there's probably, Yakima's a great place, but I mean, in terms of, I'd heard about Bellingham, right? It's really a similar, thriving college, university town. But the other ones, I took as you're probably familiar with, Pacific Workforce Development Council, or PAC Mountain is abbreviated. Thurston is sort of within that consortium of Lewis, Mason, Pacific, and Grace Harbor. We're in a relatively pretty good position, but a lot of times we'll throw those in the mix. So I took the major cities of those other surrounding counties, and I looked at how they rank. And this cool thing about this is that Olympia actually is 41.8%. We're 0.3 of a point higher than Portland, and within striking distance there of Austin. And you saw Austin's the fastest growing city in the United States at this point. And the other cool thing, I'm sort of jumping ahead because I know we've only got 1 hour, right, in terms of this.
Yeah, I'm in charge. Let me include Lacey and Tumwater.
No, that's just strictly Olympia. You can drill the data, and that's the next step. I did this for Olympia Group, but I want to run it for Tumwater and Lacey as well, and we can do that very, very quickly. But I just forgot where I was going. Whoa. So this is the actual, I looked at the rankings. I threw a couple other variables in there to see if there was anything that was causal, that might be drivers. I looked at median income. I looked at percentage that were married. A lot of times at that stability factor. I looked at cost of living index. And again, I have, but what you see right in the white there are the occupations that Florida dictates or points out are where you tend to find the most creativity. And you can see though that for the major cities, you've got Boulder right up there. Well, actually, I know what I was just going to say. You have Austin, and then what I was going to say earlier is that there's a lot of similarities. Austin's the fastest growing in the country, but it's also, right, the seat of government for the state of Texas. And it also has a weird dynamic between the bureaucratic, state government and a very bohemian academic community. The University of Texas is huge, right? I think it's actually even larger than the University of Washington. And you see the population is close to 500,000, but the similarities are somewhat interesting. They talk about, there was a book in one of the literature reviews, this weird place called, I'm not remember the exact title, weird place called Austin, that they have this weird dynamic between an ultra-conservative sort of group and then this sort of bohemian, university artist collective that seems to work for an area that historically had no natural drivers. Now, eventually Austin pulled in the IT sector that is a catalyst, and that's sort of the premise with this, is that, we have a lot similar to Austin. We're there, we have a lot. So what's the spark? Why aren't we the next hot spot? And I think it's just a matter of just, again, that's sort of the question I float to you folks, because the numbers seem to show that this is a time to buy real estate now, I guess, if you were going to forecast, right? You're going to probably see some explosion in growth. And I did the same thing for the city, so I won't go into belay this, but again, send me an email, I'll forward on the paper, but you can go through and see where the percentages are on each one of these. In terms of, so that's in context with the people component, we have the creative class relative to other recognized cities that have what it takes if Florida's work is right. The next question is, okay, we've got the people, do we have the place? And no better source than going directly. So as of July, we did a survey of all residents of Thurston County, similar to what we do with the EVI, the Economic Vitality Index. And we had 95% confidence interval with only 5% error. And so we're confident in the results. And one of the first questions we ask is, so what do you think about the state, the overall quality of life? And what's neat is 81% said it was good or excellent. Right? We only had 2% that said things were poor, or we actually, there was a large percent that said they didn't know. But anyway, that's a very positive message. I think and that jives with some of the earlier work that the United Way did in terms of when they reached out. As much as folks talked about various issues, they seem to recognize that the natural environment and the quality of life here seem to resonate or be very high, or very attractive recruiting component. When we ask folks in this other study, what do they think the major issues with this area, and that's what's neat, we can solve this, they're saying traffic, right? Well, part of that traffic is, this is the Thurston Region Climate Council, right? People are going north, right? And they have to get in a car to go find that, a job in Pierce or King County. And if we create those industries right here, right, then we solve that issue. We don't need to build an 8-lane highway, right? 4 lanes now is the process going forward in order to try to accommodate the growth. Then you see population growth seem to be a concern. Now, as you know, we have quite an eclectic community, and for the Olympia contingency, we have factions, that say we're the right size. So I don't think it's an issue of, it's the quality, right? That's where we need to decide as far as, we control what industries we want, and that are high paying and family wage jobs, not necessarily just create jobs for job's sake. And again, I'm preaching to the choir, but so if you get the right type of growth, that folks that are willing to give back to the community and to the arts and sort of further build on that, then it's probably more manageable or acceptable. And then you can see actually what's interesting out of the study, that only 2% felt climate change was an issue. I think that's part of that was just because people don't really, because of the quality of the environment, it's not something that first comes to mind. Most folks in the survey did think climate change was an issue, but just right in our backyard, it wasn't.
There's no crime up there.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. We didn't have any, this wasn't a closed set question, we just opened it up. We said, what's your first that comes to mind, major issues? So that's a good point, and I hadn't thought about it, the crime did not come up. When we ask them, the second question is, what's your second choice? Yeah, sorry.
What was the distinction between homelessness and homeless population on that?
That was a tough one. We were trying to, actually crime does come up on the second choice, but we left it open-ended, so it was a process of trying to we didn't preload it, we just said come to mind, and so we were trying to group things according to where we tend to see the most issues pop up, and so that was just an attempt to try to, there were enough differences that we tried to just break those apart. But again, traffic, number one, the other question a lot of folks have asked is, what do you mean by water supply, right? And there was just a range of folks that responded, so we just sort of lumped that together. But again, you see the traffic is the #1 issue there again. How are we doing on time, okay?
Yeah, 5 more minutes and
Okay.
I'm cutting you off.
Then, now the idea of mapping our community is not new. Again, the EDC and Michael K has done a phenomenal job. And this is the Blue Ribbon panel. This one for quite a few years, mapping out assets and showing where where we saw overlap. Then they work with an outside firm out of Idaho to do some cluster analysis to identify where, again, like workforce development is always like driving in the rearview mirror. You're playing with people's lives and you're trying to estimate where you should focus their efforts and assume that there's going to be an industry or job for them, right, based on past data. But based on this, they found these sectors or these industries as possibly growth areas for the 5-county region. So this is a regional assessment. And so basically the premise on this is there's been a lot of inward reflection in terms of what might be a good fit for this community. And now again, it's just what's the spark to get us to the next stage. So in summary, there. So one of the things that seems to be vibrant about Austin is a very thriving music scene. And I didn't realize, some of you realize I did an economic analysis for the impact of the music industry for this area. And it was pretty sobering to see, the influence. But we also have a historical legacy. I think for those, grunge, and then I think there's been Mike Olson is a well-known musician in this area. Has talked about there's a lot of blues or jazz historical influence in the 50s and 60s groups that come through. So we have a legacy that could be some signature events that could drive the younger millennials and others to this area that then puts us, along with. It's multifaceted, but it's something that we hang our hats on. The tugboat races don't really do it for the younger generation. I don't think come on down and watch the Foss. But I'm being sarcastic, sorry. But the other thing is the microbrewery, and as Diane knows in the past, St. Martin's has been looking at that as well. And the Tumwater, now with the new zone that's been approved, that's the driving area. We did some research, with the younger generation. Historically, you think of wine as sort of the ranking, and then comes beer, but the younger millennials, craft microbreweries in terms of craft, sort of micros in terms of the size, and craft sort of the quality component, my understanding, is preferred over wine for the younger generation. So we certainly could drive, with those kinds of events, combine those. International Culture Center is something that, with this last May, we were over in China, and there's been some interest in making this a hub for that as well. So we have, just in summary, we have a lot of things going for us. The final thing here is for those that were at the real estate development, the EDC's real estate forum. One of the things, I think it was Zach with Prime Locations talked about, that he's getting a lot of inquiries, and it's almost like this is Seattle 40 years ago, right? That people in hindsight going back to the future thought, geez, if I'd only bought then in Everett, not Everett, but in Bellevue or in Wallingford or Ballard or Fremont, I would not have to be working anymore, right? I would be just, and I think there's a general assessment because of a lot of these things. We have that component and we have the right location. We're probably we're there, so it's probably, I'll open it up for questions. So that's basically the gist of it. And I haven't done this for Lacey yet, but there's, as you know, our communities are overlapping.
We do have time for questions.
Yes. If no one asks any questions, you're not making a set, right? Okay, yes, that's right.
So I don't know if this is a question or more of an observation, but I was downtown Saturday night in Olympia, and I think an interesting comparison is how does Olympia compare to some of these other cities at night versus during the day? Because if you're in Walla Walla, or if you're in Portland, or if you're in Austin, the music and the sense of safety and walking around is a whole lot different there in the evening than it is downtown Olympia. And I think that's a sort of a critical component of how to make a city vibrant, is for people to feel safe and for it to feel that way in the evening as well as during the day.
Now, technically, we didn't phase it. We didn't coach them, and we left it open-ended. And Ken's right. Crime didn't come up, but But that could be, you know, an effort to ask folks to rank day versus evening, certainly for certain areas. But that is a concern for downtown Olympia. I know that's come up.
Yeah,
I think part of your study component should be of asking the general population to use shop in downtown Olympia.
Yeah.
I know many people will not.
Well, parking also is the issue historically, yeah.
Chelsea has a question over here.
We're actually, we're
Well, I just wondered if there's any recognition or a similar component to the proximity of the very large military base and what that may or may not have an influence on.
Oh, we know it definitely. It's basically it's a fiscal stimulus. We're blessed in the state to have, a regional medical hospital, training facility, Joint Base Fort Lewis. I mean, it's a huge driver, and that's why this, the scaling down the striker brigades and other things has major concern to EDC and others, because we're going to see that certainly in North Powder County and certainly in Lacey. Right?
Do any of those other communities that were on the chart have a similar, or do you know?
Yeah, honestly, I guess, but that could be a variable that we could try to pull out to see if that's a driver. I think one of the main things he seemed to, it cuts across, it's basically creative problem solving, and that cuts across a lot of occupations, but he said the super creative classes where you have an art scene or artists or performing arts, visual arts, and so that nature seems to be, something that's crucial to be there. And I think, probably proximity to military bases and stuff, you have folks that probably they try to supplement or, play music, but also as far as just an audience, that goes and decides to, to spin because there's sorry.
Oh, I was going to say that I moved down here about 4 years ago from Seattle, intentionally, by accident.
You're a trendsetter.
I know, right? Always. And I think something that's important to recognize about Austin is, Austin's motto for how long has been like, keep Austin weird.
Yeah, exactly,
right?
that's the, yeah.
And something that's made me really sad in this area and moving here, and something that I think holds us back, is that there's always this us versus them kind of thing going on, and whether it's people who favor growth versus don't favor growth, or it's Olympia versus Lacey, or it's downtown versus suburban, or it's whatever, that we tend to get caught up in those discussions rather than relishing in the fact that I love the fact that we've got conservative and liberal and urban and country.
Well, that's
and
ironic.
everything in
That's what
between.
Austin has. Yeah, and so
And that's what we have
so
too,
there's a model.
but I think we could embrace it better.
Your generation.
Yeah, we just need.
I have a full copy of the report, and I look forward to tearing it apart. We always give a book, as you know, to our speaker and to sign something that's appropriate. Well, we thought our speaker was going to be shelter boxes. Rotary works with disasters around the world. So we have a book called I Survived 5 Epic Disasters. I don't know that it's entirely appropriate for Riley, but we thank you very much for doing that and for filling in the last minute. Thank you again.